In this video I'm going to take a look at a recording of a bass guitar, and what I'm going to do is try to identify the fundamental frequencies of two notes that were played in this recording. Now the recording is available up at this website here, and the MATLAB code will all be available up at this WordPress site. So some of the code is probably difficult to follow in the video, but if you download the code you'll be able to go through it later on yourself. Now there are lots of comments in this particular video, or in the code anyway, associated with the video. And the reason for that is I'm going to use MATLAB's publish facility to create a PDF document which will have all the images and figures, so it might be easier for it to go through afterwards as well. So I'll put that up on the WordPress site as well. But let's get started, and what I'll do first of all is I'm going to read in the WAV file using the WAV read function. I'm going to extract out a segment which contains the two notes that I'm interested in. I'm also going to just plot the segment so that you can see what I'm talking about. This part of the code down here is just annotating the plot to show you where the notes exist and the fundamental frequencies of those. So that's just one example of the code that I was talking about that might be a little bit difficult to interpret, but you'll see what I mean when I plot it. So let's just evaluate this section here, and what you'll hear as well is the two notes being played when I click evaluate. So here we go. Okay, so you should have heard those two notes, and I'll play them back again in a second. But these are the annotations that I was talking about, so that's some of that code is difficult to interpret unless you can have time to go through it slowly. But this second note here has a frequency of 86 Hz, and there's my first note here of frequency 72 Hz. Now each note is roughly about 10,000 samples, and the overall duration is roughly about half a second. I think it's probably 4.5 seconds in fact. So let's go back into the script, and what I'm going to do first of all is what I want to do is identify the frequency of the fundamental of the first note, and what I'm going to do is just take out 2,000 samples from the start of that segment. So I'm going to go from sample number 1 up to 1999, and I'm going to take the FFT of that frame and get the magnitudes of it using the ABS function in MATLAB. And what I'm going to do is just display the first 250 bins. There will of course be 2,000 bins in total associated with this particular frame. We're only going to look at the first 250. Now the reason for that is because most of the frequency information is in the lower frequency region. So let me just rescale that so you can see a little bit more clearly. So as I predicted, there's not much frequency energy up at these higher bins, and what we've got here is a fundamental and two harmonics. Let me just zoom in first of all to show you those two. Okay, so there's my fundamental, and there are my two harmonics, and the fundamental lies at the third bin frequency. Okay, so interpreting this, I'd say, okay, well, what frequency is associated with that bin? And in general, it's a very easy thing to do. So if you ever have a bin frequency, the frequency associated with that bin is the bin number multiplied by the sampling frequency divided by n. Okay, so in our case it's 66.15 Hz. Now I know that this estimate of 66.15 Hz is inaccurate. The fundamental frequency of the first note is roughly about 72 Hz. Now this inaccuracy is basically due to what's known as the DFT frequency resolution. And basically what that is it's the separation in frequency between bins in Hertz essentially. So the separation between bins is given by this expression. It's given by Fs divided by n. So in our case our frequency resolution associated with the DFT is 22.05 Hertz. So basically what that means is well, the 0th DFT bin is always associated with 0 Hz. The first bin in this case will have a frequency of 22.05 Hz. The second bin will be 44.1 Hz. The third bin will be, as we've seen, 66.15 22.15 Hertz. So each frequency bin, or each DFT bin, is separated in frequency by 22.05 Hertz. Now, what this means is if we're ever analysing the magnitude spectrum obtained using the DFT, is that if we look at the DFT bin number, we can only be accurate to within 22.05 Hertz in this case. Now, this causes problems because being accurate to within 22.05 Hertz isn't good enough for audio applications. Now, it does depend on the application that you're interested in, but for audio, that certainly isn't good enough. Now, a way to improve that, or to get a better frequency estimate, is to increase n, or increase basically the length of the signal that we're analysing, or the length of the time domain signal that we're analysing. Because it can be seen that if I increase n, so let's imagine that n was 5000, our frequency estimate is going to be within 8.82 Hertz, because our DFT frequency resolution has improved. So now I'll just show you that in action. So if I just scroll down here, oh, actually, before getting onto that, I just want to run through one thing. I showed you earlier on that I identified that the maximum or the location of the fundamental was at bin number 3 by zooming in on the plot of the magnitude spectrum of the first note. An alternative approach is to use MATLAB's built-in function, and I just want to run through this code because I use this code quite frequently in this script, so it's just important that you're comfortable with it. What I'm using is the max function, which is built into MATLAB, as I said, and it will determine the maximum of a sequence of numbers, and the sequence of numbers in this case is the magnitude spectrum. And what the max function does, it returns two values. It returns the value of the maximum in a sequence of numbers and also the location of that maximum. Now, the location of the maximum is always going to be one different to the bin number. And that's really down to the way MATLAB indexes its arrays. So MATLAB's indexing scheme always starts off at a value of 1, whereas the DFT indexing scheme, or sorry, rather the when we're talking about bins or bin values, we start off at bin number 0 being the first element. So there's a discrepancy there of 1, and that note is just there. Okay, so just be aware of that. So if I run this piece of code here, I'll just paste it in. We'll see that the location of the it says the fundamental location variable has a value of 4. But now the bin number is actually 3, so I need to subtract 1 from that, and I do that further down here when I do my calculation of fundamental frequency. So let's just evaluate that, and I see that my fundamental frequency is 66.15, and it's obtained using this expression here, which is the fundamental location minus 1. So the reason why I want to highlight that again is just that that piece of code reappears quite a bit in the script, and I just want you to know what's going on. Now the reason why I have that in the script is because I want to be able to run this script at the very end and use it with MATLAB's publishing tool. So let's get back on to estimating the fundamental frequencies associated with each of the notes. So this part of the code I am going to extract a frame, this time of length 5000. So the first time was n was 2000, but otherwise the code is exactly the same. So if I evaluate that script and I plot it, just let me resize that so you can see it. Again, we have 250 bins, okay, and we see the fundamental and the 3 harmonics. And if I zoom this time in on the fundamental, I see that the fundamental has a bin frequency of 8, whereas the previous case it was 3, of course. But of course the length of our frame has increased. So what I'm going to do now is just run these two pieces of code, which will determine the fundamental location and work out the fundamental frequency using this expression. I will evaluate it, and we see that we have a fundamental frequency estimate this time of 70.56, which is more accurate than our previous case. Now, how accurate it is again just down to the DFT frequency resolution. And the DFT frequency resolution in this case is fs divided by 5000, which is the same as fs divided by n, of course. Okay, so what I can say about this fundamental frequency estimate is that it's accurate to within 8.82 Hertz. Now let's just go back to the script again, and we'll do the same process, but this time what I'd like to do is take a look at the second note, which is at the end of the segment. So I'm going to use a frame length again of 5000, but this time I'm going to extract segments from the end. So that's that piece of code there. I'm going to use the same DFT, same number of display the same number of DFT bins, 250. So I'll just evaluate that segment and just resize it again so that you can see it. We can see that we've got a fundamental. This time we have 3 harmonics. There's a more significant harmonic in this case. Let's just zoom in to see the fundamental frequency of this note, and we can see that the fundamental frequency occurs at bin number 10. So the frequency then would be associated with that would be 10 multiplied by fs divided by n, which is 88.2 Hertz. And again, that's reasonably accurate. I know that the second note has a fundamental frequency of 86. I'm just going to run through this code again, because just to remind you that it's pretty much the same as what I've just written at the command window. So if I evaluate that section, I'm seeing that I'm getting the frequency of 88.2 Hertz, the same as above here. Okay, and we're to again just remind you, the accuracy of that is fs divided by n, so that's accurate to within 8.82 Hertz. That accuracy isn't great for audio applications either, so I'm just going to go back into the script. And what I'll do now is we'll evaluate the entire the entire segment which contains both notes. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting n equal to the length of the signal, and I'm taking the FFT of that segment, and I am going to analyze the FFT again over 250 bins. So let's just evaluate that segment first of all. Okay, so I'll just resize that. So we can see our 250 bins here, and what we have is a higher frequency resolution DFT, but it's also a more complex FFT because we have the presence of 2 notes in this magnitude spectrum. So we've got the fundamental and harmonics of 2 notes, which is making this a little bit difficult to interpret. To make it easier, I've written a little piece of code that will highlight the fundamental harmonics of each of these segments. So I'll just go back to the script and I'll show you that code now. Now it's not important if you understand this code, it might be a little bit difficult to follow. All it's doing is really going to highlight some of the notes, the fundamental harmonics of each note to being a particular color so that we can see them. So let me evaluate that section. And there we go. So we can see that the fundamental harmonics of note 1 are now shown in red. Excuse me. And the fundamental harmonics of the second note are now shown in green, just so we can see them more easily. Now, if I zoom in on the note 1, we can see that the maximum occurs at bin number 31. Now, let me just scroll down and we'll just evaluate the this piece of code to determine the fundamental frequency associated with the maximum. Go back into the command window. We see that my frequency estimate is now 71.9488, and that's the frequency estimate of the fundamental associated with note 2. Now I'll need to go back into my plot to determine the maximum of the fundamental of note 2. So zooming in on the green one there shows that the fundamental has a frequency of 37. I'll just go back into my script and we're just going to use this line here to evaluate the fundamental of node 2. I couldn't do this automatically easily, so that's why I've hard coded the value of 37 in here. And we see that the fundamental frequency of node 2, the estimate, is given by 85.8744. And that is a reasonable estimate of the frequency of the fundamental of node 2. Now, the accuracy of that is fs divided by n, or DFT frequency resolution. So what we can say is that those frequency estimates are accurate to within 2.32 Hertz. Now this frequency resolution came at the expense of a complex magnitude spectrum, or rather a complicated looking magnitude spectrum. So we can see there's a lot going on in this magnitude spectrum. But there is an alternative approach that you can use to get high frequency resolution without having to deal with this complicated looking magnitude spectrum. And I'll just show you how to do that. It's using a technique known as zero padding, which is pretty straightforward. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the situation where I had a frame which took 5,000 samples from the first part of the segment, so that was associated with node 1. And what I'm going to do is append 40,000 zeros to the end of the frame. And what I'm doing there is I'm making the frame artificially longer. Okay, my frame length is 5,000 samples initially, and then after doing this zero padding process, which is very straightforward to do in MATLAB, all I'm doing is appending 40,000 zeros using a built-in function in MATLAB called zeros to the frame that I extracted up here, and I'm calling that zpad frame. And I'm creating a new variable called new frame len, which is the length of zpad frame. So this segment, or this signal zpad frame, is about 45,000 samples long. I'll just plot that for you so you're able to visualize a little bit easier. Okay, I'll just resize it so you can see. But you can see here, there's my 5,000 samples from my signal initially, and then I've zero padded out to this length. Now, something that's just struck me as I've done that plot is that for all my FFT analysis, I haven't windowed my frames. And for those of you who are familiar with windowing, you'll be going, I should have zero padded all those frames, and you're quite right. Best practice would dictate that I would window each of the frames, but I didn't in this video presentation because I just wanted to keep the code less complex. It was already looking a little bit complex, so I said I'd leave out the windowing. And of course that would have an impact on my overall results, but I don't think it takes away too much from the key points I'm trying to get across in this video, which is really about DFT frequency resolution. But you should window. Now if you don't know what windowing is, don't worry about that. You can find out about that later on. So now let's just get back to the process of taking the DFT of this new zpad frame, which is just my frame with 40,000 zeros appended to it, and let me just evaluate this part of the code, and I'll resize that so that you can see what's going on. And we can see this here is my fundamental frequency of node 1, and I've got my two harmonics there. Now if I zoom in on the map here, we see that it's roughly a value of 73. Okay, and if I run this little piece of code I have down further and I evaluate it, that'll determine the fundamental frequency. So we can see here that the fundamental frequency is 71.54 Hertz using this approach, which is a little bit different to what we saw when we took the DFT of the entire frame. But again, you have to remember that these estimates are only estimates, and the estimates, or the DFT analysis, isn't being applied to pure sinusoidal components. They are sinusoidal or quasi-sinusoidal components but they're not pure sinusoidal components, so they're going to vary slightly. Okay, but you would say that the frequency resolution associated with this is fs divided by, in this case, the frequency resolution is fs divided by new frame length. So the frequency resolution is roughly about 1 Hertz. So far what we've seen is by taking longer time domain segments, we can extract more frequency information using the DFT. And we also saw that we can make time domain segments artificially longer by using this very simple process called zero padding. Now, to finish up this video, what I would like to do now is to really just take a look at what happens if we take shorter frame lengths and see the consequences of that. So I've written some code in here to do that. So let's just scroll down. And I'm starting off by just taking a look at what happens if we make the length of the segment 1500 samples long. Now I'm changing the number of bins to display to 100, so let's just evaluate that section and I'll resize it. There we go. And we can see now by reducing the time domain segment that the fundamental and the harmonics are getting closer together in terms of their separation between frequency bins. So we can see the fundamental occurs at bin number 2 and the first harmonic occurs at bin number 5. So separation is down to just a few bins. And as we reduce the length of the time domain signal that we're analysing, the separation between harmonics in terms of bins will be further reduced. So let's just look at the case where we reduce the segment down to 1200 samples, and again we can see that there's been a reduction in terms of the separation between the component. Let's just zoom in there so we can see that. Okay, oops, I'll just zoom in again. So we can see now that there's the fundamental and the first harmonic, and it's actually become difficult to identify the higher harmonic because the separation between those components has reduced so much. Let's go into the script again, and we'll reduce the length of the time domain window by another little bit. So it's now down to 1000, and we'll just evaluate that selection. And when we go down to 1000 samples, we can see that the fundamental and the harmonics are no longer easily not separated clearly anymore. In the magnitude spectrum, it's likely that your first impression is that there is one sinusoidal component present in that signal. So what this highlights is that the length of the time domain window is important. If you go too low, you don't get enough frequency separation between components. Now the reason why you don't get enough separation between components is because you don't have enough time domain information. And what oftentimes happens when somebody's starting out with DFT frequency domain analysis is that they say, well, okay, well, why don't we just zero pad out the time domain signal that we have in order to improve the frequency resolution and therefore separate out the frequency components. Now you can try that, and what you'll see is that you don't get any separation, and understanding why that is the case is a little bit tricky. It'll take a little bit of time to fully understand, and we won't be doing that here, unfortunately. It'll just take a little bit more time, but maybe to appreciate why, a good starting point might be to consider the following. Imagine we took this to an extreme where we said, well, listen, let's make our frame length one sample long. Well, conceptually then you could appreciate that, well, you can't really extract frequency information from one sample. It just can't happen. Frequency is the rate of change of something, and if you have one sample you can't measure the rate of change, or at least the rate of change is zero, and that single value represents a DC component. So the idea of just zero padding when we have a very short frame doesn't work, and hopefully over the next while, when you get your head around how the DFT works, you'll appreciate why that is the case. But for the moment, that's it. Thanks for your attention.